Hello students, Mr. John here with Chapter 9, Lesson 2. Lesson 2 is entitled Early Challenges. Let's talk about it, shall we? So, the revolution is won, the Constitution is written, George Washington is president. He's got a whole slew of new problems to face. Basically, starting anything new and untried can be very difficult, and it's going to be the case with the United States of America. There are problems coming from within the nation as well as external threats. Today, we're going to discuss all these problems and how they were handled. How were they handled by the Washington administration? All right, we start off with domestic problems. We start off with the Whiskey Rebellion. So, a lot of people don't know this story. In the last lesson, we talked about Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. We've got a new bank. He's proposing new taxes to help pay off all these debts from the Revolution. In 1791, Congress passes a tax on the manufacture and sales of liquor. So, like not beer, liquor. Things like whiskey. Now, it's often referred to as the whiskey tax and therefore the Whiskey Rebellion because whiskey was the main liquor consumed in the United States at that time. I think over in Britain, across the ocean, they were all about the rum. The United States is all about whiskey. Now, the whiskey tax, as a result, was universally despised throughout the entire country. Basically, one of their most favorite things, whiskey, is now more expensive to make and more expensive to sell because it's being taxed. In western Pennsylvania, particularly, a tax was really, really bad for them. They were super angry because in western PA, one of the main crops was corn. And corn was then distilled to make whiskey. Whiskey was so prominent in western Pennsylvania that it was actually a form of currency. So as a result, it's pretty much wrecked that sort of that way of life here in western Pennsylvania. And they were super angry about it. The farmers, these corn farmers, were actually so against the tax, they hated it so much that they threatened, beat up, and burned down the houses of tax collectors, sort of like before the Revolution. This army of angry farmers grew and grew and started to become a real problem for the federal government, this new federal government. Basically, the federal government wasn't collecting any of the whiskey tax from western Pennsylvania, and the government doesn't like it when they're not collecting their taxes. To deal with this, George Washington sent an army to dispel the Whiskey Rebellion and enforce the tax. The farmers basically they gave up. They kind of went home when they heard there was an army coming. They couldn't handle that. Some of the leaders of the Whiskey Rebellion were actually convicted of treason and hanged, but many just had to start paying the tax, which was now enforced by soldiers left behind by Washington. The whole incident showed that the new government was not afraid to flex its muscle to enforce the law. Yeah, the old tar and feather treatment made a comeback. All right, let's talk about challenges in the West. The Northwest Territory, sort of that Ohio, Michigan, Indiana type territory. All this was a hotbed of trouble for George Washington. The Spanish and British did their part to exacerbate this problem by stirring up the natives, getting them to attack American settlers off in that frontier. They were hoping that these, basically it being dangerous as a result of the natives, would keep the Americans from spreading west too rapidly, which they had a habit of doing. Washington tried to sign treaties with the natives, but this didn't really help because no one would adhere to the treaties. No settlers would. Basically, Washington would try to draw lines, much like that old proclamation we talked about, and say, all right, stop attacking us, and I promise no one will move past this line. And then the settlers wouldn't listen. They'd move past the line. They'd still get attacked by settlers. So Americans are dying off on the frontier. Washington has to send an army out to the Northwest Territories in 1791 in an attempt to restore order. This army actually lost to the natives in a big battle. The leader of these natives was a chief by the name of Little Turtle. American forces failed that time, but they went back in 1794, 3 years later, this time under the leadership of a guy by the name of General Anthony Wayne, who defeated the natives at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, forcing them off the land that makes up what is now mostly Ohio. So there we go. Those are domestic problems. The shift to foreign problems, external threats. In 1793, France had its own revolution to overthrow their monarchy. We learn a lot about the French Revolution in World Studies, which is your 7th grade history class. You may remember a little bit about it. They overthrew the king. At first, many Americans supported this revolution. That seems a lot like the American Revolution. But then it just got really, really nasty and violent. Some Americans began to think the French were going a little overboard. They were going a little too far. The same year, France and Britain go to war again, and now you've got Americans, and some of them support the British in this conflict, and some of them support the French. Some of them are happy that France is overthrowing its monarchy, and then they're like, oh, they're getting nasty. And they don't know what to do. The country is split on who to support. Washington's plan was to stay neutral, was just stay out of it, but there were a lot of external forces putting pressure on him to choose a side. France was trying to recruit American volunteers to attack British ships like privateers. We've got a lot of experience with that. The British were seizing American ships that were trading with France, so messing with our commerce. The British also had this practice of impressment where they would take U.S. sailors from American ships and then force them to work for the British Navy. A lot like kidnapping grown men and forcing them to work on your boat. And what are you going to do? You're in the middle of the ocean. You can't escape. So they're being forced to work in the British Navy. Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, officially saying the U.S. wasn't taking any sides. And then he sent John Jay to make a treaty with the British. Jay's treaty got the British to agree to finally remove all their troops from North American soil. They still had some fortresses off in the wilderness. But actually didn't do anything about the impressment problem. So the treaty was criticized by many, but was ultimately approved by the Senate, even though it didn't do anything about the impressment. Here's the thing. Jay's treaty made Spain think that the U.S. and Britain were buddying up to knock Spain out of North America. So this made them nervous, so Washington sent another diplomat to go treat with the Spanish. This guy's name was Thomas Pinckney, and he worked out a treaty called Pinckney's Treaty with Spain. Basically, kind of mended the relationship, settled any qualms Spain had, and he worked it out so that Americans could use the Mississippi River to ship their goods down to the end of the Mississippi River, which was Spanish-controlled New Orleans. So that was great for American business. That pretty much sums up the lesson. Real quick at the end here, we want to talk about Washington decides that 2 terms as president, that's 8 years, is enough, and he's going to set his precedence of 2-term presidents. At the end, when he was giving his sort of farewell address, he said, "'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." Makes sense considering the Proclamation of Neutrality. So far, as we are now at liberty to do it. There we go. He also, these words, this policy of his, this statement, would affect American foreign policy for 100 years. That's a whole century. He also warned us about factions, aka political parties, which we'll talk about more in the next lesson. Wise words, Mr. President, wise words. Now, for your assignment today, let's take a look at this quote again. It's written here in case the picture tweaks out. "'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, so far as we are now at liberty to do it." For today's assignment, please answer the following question. In complete sentences, what does the above quote by Washington at his farewell address mean? So what does this mean? It's a little old-timey English, but I think you can get the point. If you don't, if you need me to steer you in the right direction, just shoot me a Canvas message or something, and I'll put you in the right direction so you can answer the question correctly and get your 5 points. Now, if you're doing this assignment on the day it is due, as most of my kids do, that means it is November 22nd. And that means tomorrow is Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving. And we have off that day, as well as Friday, so we'll be picking up with Lesson 3 on Monday the 27th. And we're in the holiday season, so winter break is coming, and New Year's and all that jazz. It's a fun time of year. If you need anything, please let me know. Otherwise, have a good day, all right?